They laughed when she laid the first stone. They chuckled harder when she vanished inside the mountain with nothing but a lantern and a shovel. Some of the men made wagers by the saloon fire. "She'll freeze for Christmas," they said. "You don't sleep in rock, you die in it." But as the first snow came screaming down the ridge, coating cabins in a bitter sheet of white and driving animals straight off the hills, something strange happened. Her chimney still smoked every morning, same as before, and nobody could understand why. Her name was Ada Loomis, 35, sharp-featured, already a widow twice by her own telling, and carrying a baby on her hip with no father in sight. She arrived that spring, driving a cart pulled by a sway-backed mule, asking no help, offering no name at first. Just bought a scrap of land no one else had dared touch. Too steep, too rocky, too shaded, and paid in coins that looked polished smooth by time. One settler claimed he'd seen her hammering nails with the back of a meat cleaver. Another swore she slept outside through the summer with thonley and oilskin sheet. Whatever the truth, nobody invited her to the harvest dances or quilting bees. It wasn't out of cruelty, people just didn't know what to make of her. They didn't even notice the cave at first. You had to hike past a sheer wall of bramble, then duck under a shelf of black pine, then squeeze between two boulders shaped like broken teeth. Back in there, the mountain had split itself open, not wide, but deep. Cold in summer, yes. But curiously still, no wind, no echo, just a silent, unmoving dark that pressed like velvet on your lungs, the kind of place men feared more than they'd admit. The kind-of place Ada chose to sleep. She didn't build a cabin like the rest. She built walls inside the cave. She hauled every board herself, split them by hand, dragged them by rope, scraped her arms bloody getting them through the narrow pass inside she erected for posts, tamped the earth flat, laid down a frame, and sealed the space with stone and clay so tightly the wind couldn't weep. Through her chimney rose barely a foot from the outer rock face, black and fast by use. She didn't smile much, never asked for company when a young man offered to bring her firewood. She said no when a preacher came to speak about loneliness. She left him standing on the snow. She's touched, they whispered, but some nights, especially late in November, when the cold set in like a nail through the spine, folks began to wonder because her mule never shivered, because her smoke never stopped, because her child, barely walking, never coughed once all winter. Some began to say maybe she'd found something in that cave. Maybe it was warmer under the ground. Maybe it held heat like a larder held salt. But nobody dared ask her outright, and she never said. Then came the blizzard. It hit on a Monday. Snow blasted in horizontal sheets. Trees snapped in half, and roofs groaned under the weight. One cabin collapsed before nightfall. The Taylor twins almost died of smoke inhalation after their chimney iced over. A family up the ridge lost their cow and found it frozen stiff near the fence line, but the widow's chimney still smoked. Next morning, a glow came from inside the mountain, flickering soft like a lantern set behind thick glass. And now, finally, someone got curious enough to go see. His name was Cal Wharton, 19, always trying to prove himself. He didn't ask for permission, just slung his rifle and went up the pass before dawn. He didn't return that night. They found him 2 days later sitting near her cave, blanket over his lap, staring into the snow like he'd seen something wrong in the world. "She made stew," he whispered, "with onions, real ones, and the baby has socks, real ones. What do you see inside?" They asked him. He didn't answer, just looked at his hands and said, "I don't think she's cold." That's when the whispering turned to something else. Not curiosity anymore, not mockery, but suspicion. Because no woman should live like that, not without help, not without someone. And that's when the real trouble began. It started with Reverend Brave, who never liked her much to begin with. He claimed no woman should live alone with a child in the dark, said it was an invitation to ungodliness, that caves were unnatural, that devil-like places where light didn't go. Then Martha Griggs joined in, saying she'd heard the baby crying at odd hours, not like a baby should cry. Said it darkly. By the end of the week, a group of them decided to pay a visit. Not a mob exactly. Just 4 or 5 townsfolk with warm coats and self-righteous hearts. They said they'd bring a pie, pretend it was just a neighborly check-in, but they never got past the rock teeth. The pass was blocked, not by boulders, but by a wall of wood and snow, carefully stacked, chinked with mud, frozen solid. Someone had taken the tomato, wedged logs and horizontally, overlapping like a barricade. "She doesn't want visitors," one of them muttered. "She's hiding something," said another. By then, the winter had sunk in like a fever. Frost cracked doors open. Wind stripped shingles from the roofs, and the air inside most cabins felt like knives. Children slept in shifts so they could rotate close to the stove. Frostbite claimed 3 toes off a man's left foot. A baby died, but Ada Loomis kept her fire going. Then one morning, a girl named Eliza ran into town barefoot through the snow. Her lips were blue. Her skin was raw. Our chimney fell in. She gasped, "Mama can't breathe. Daddy's passed out. Please, please help." And noon could move because they were all too cold. The sheriff tried to rally volunteers, but the snow was chest deep. The storm hadn't stopped. The church bell had frozen mid-ranging. And just when they thought all was lost, smoke came from the ridge again, but this time to chimneys. Ada had opened her cave. She had another fire going. She de-pulled the second stove up, lit it, built a lenou in the cliff near the entrance, and hung cloth to keep the wind out. When they followed the trail, they found the girl's family laid out inside, bundled in extra quilts. Steam rising from bowls of broth. The cave was still warm. Nobody spoke, nobody dialogued, nobody even breathed loud. Because now, for the first time, they understood the widow wasn't hiding, she was surviving. And she'd built something no man had thought to build, not a cabin, a refuge. The strange thing about survival is that it doesn't look like triumph, it looks like stillness, it looks like smoke drifting up where it shouldn't, or the creak of a hinge in a place too silent for days. After Ada Loomis opened her cave to the dying, no one said a word for a long while, not even the sheriff. They just stood there on the slope looking at the family she'd saved, and then at her face smudged with soot, sharp with exhaustion, utterly calm. Shouldn't speak until the little girl, Eliza, whispered, "My daddy stopped coughing." Then Ada turned and said, "He'll need water again in an hour. You'll keep him warm." And that was it. She slipped back inside the cave into the low darkness where her own child was swaddled in blankets. Before a stove of black iron that hissed gently, it wasn't a cave anymore. Not in the way they thought. It was a room, a home. The walls weren't damp or jagged. They were paneled with rough pine, chinked with clay, hung with quilts that kept the cold from Festone. A handmade curtain, faded red, hung at the mouth of the sleeping nook. A shelf lined with mason jars stood in a recess she'd carved herself. Nothing lavish, nothing decorative, but so solid it felt like you could sleep through an avalanche inside it. The stove's warmth didn't vanish into the ceiling like it did in cabins. The rock absorbed it, held it close, let it seep back out slowly, constant, predictable. Ada had stacked stones behind the stove's belly to catch the heat. She'd buried warm bricks under her floorboards, and along far wall she dug a pit, not deep, just enough to keep potatoes from freezing and water from icing up. But that wasn't the miracle. The miracle was the silence, the total absence of howling wind, the way you could hear a match strike or a child's breath without strain. It made some folks uncomfortable, like they'd entered a church they weren't worthy to be in, so they left quietly. But the news spread. By the end of that week, 2 more families had tried to build lintos against the rock face near the widow's cave. One managed to rig a canvas shelter, another begged Ada for help. She didn't say yes, shouldn't say no, she just handed them a bucket of coals and told them, keep it covered, as traps heat. The storm hadn't let up. The air was cruel enough to snap axe handles, and the children in town were walking with rags tied around their boots, their fingers swollen and red. One boy was caught licking a rail post, his tongue frozen to the iron. The doctor's house was out of kerosene, and the church's windows had shattered from the cold. But Ada's cave was still warm. And slowly, the way water finds every crack and stone, people began to come closer. It wasn't an invasion, Not at first. Just quiet knocks near dawn, a woman with a newborn, a man with a busted foot, an old miner who couldn't breathe without coughing blood. Shouldn't invite them inside, but she didn't turn them away either. She opened the side shelter and laid out hay. She boiled snow for broth. She handed out bricks wrapped in burlap for warming hands. When the sheriff tried to ask how she kept so much heat, she simply said, "Stononi remembers fire better than wood," but there were others who didn't like it. Some called it pride, some called it witchcraft, others just hated the humiliation of being shown up by a woman, especially a quiet one, especially one who didn't ask for help or permission. Reverend Braid stirred the pot first. "She's made herself a mountain queen," he said in a sermon laced with frost and scorn. "Living above us, lording over us, a woman of no husband, no congregation, no humility." Others echoed him. The Jenkins brothers said they'd seen a strange light from inside the cave. Someone claimed she dug a tunnel all the way to the river and was stealing heat from underground fire vents. It didn't make sense, but when people are cold enough, sense doesn't matter. The town was splitting down the middle. Some believed Ada was a blessing. Others believed she was cheating nature. Then came the morning of the fire. It started in the saloon. Too much whiskey, too little caution, a knocked-over lamp, flames licking dry curtains. The whole front caught like kindling. No one died, but 3 families lost everything: blankets, food, stoves, even their winter clothes. They were left with the smoke on their coats and the ash in their teeth. And there was only one place they could go up the ridge. The sheriff came first, knocking with bare knuckles on a log frozen into place. She met him with her child on her hip, fire behind her, casting a long red halo over the snow. He said, "We need shelter." She didn't ask who, she just asked how many. 10. He said, "Maybe 11. She stared at the snow for a moment, then nodded. "No more than 2 days. After that, they build their own," and that's how it began. She let them in, not into her bedroom, but into the outer chamber, the lean-to, the side hollows she'd cleared. She showed them how to trap heat, how to hang blankets along the wall to stop wind creep, how to warm stones and bury them near feet, how to boil pine needles when the caw get bad. But she also made rules: no loud talking, no open flames without her word, no wandering past the curtain. She was calm but not soft. She let a man go back out in the snow when he broke the second rule. He tried to sneak a pipe lit with a coal. She caught him before the ember touched wood. "Stone doesn't burn easy," she said, "but cloth does, and he don't let babies die." He left. Nobody else challenged her after that. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't, was that Ada hadn't chosen the cave out of madness or pride. She'd chosen it out of memory because the last cabin she'd built years ago on the edge of a prairie had collapsed on her during a storm. Her second husband died that night. Her baby hadn't been born yet. She'd clawed her way out of the wreckage alone. After that, she never trusted timber again. And when she found the cave cold, silent, unwelcome, she recognized it for what it was: not a prison, not a tomb, but a promise. If she could make it hers, it would not betray her. Not the way roofs did, not the way beams cracked and nails popped loose. So she fought the stone. She chiseled, shoveled, scraped, and sealed. It took her 8 weeks just to make the air inside livable, another for to keep the warmth. She slept with her child wrapped in every coat she owned, listening to the stove we until the draft caught properly. And now it was the only place in the valley still warm. But peace doesn't last in cold country. Especially not when people start thinking they deserve what you built. Especially not when they think you're hoarding it. The whispers returned. No. Or darker, she's hiding supplies. She's feeding only who she favors. She's got gold hidden in that mountain. The Jenkins brothers already bid her from the fire. Began organizing what they called a proper inspection. The reverend encouraged it for the good of the community, he said. But what they really wanted was to own it, not help her, not thank her, just take it. The sheriff warned her, rode up in the dusk with frost in his beard. "They're coming," he said. "Not all of them, just the loud ones." She looked at her sleeping child, then back at him. "Let them come," she said, "but I won't let them pass the curtain." You'll need help. I've had help, she said softly, touching stone wall. This place doesn't shake. That's more than most men. He rode back down alone. That night, the wind picked up again, the worst howl of the winter, and as the valley hunkered down, a row of lanterns moved up the ridge. 6 men, 3 axes, 1 rope. And what they found when they reached the caves, Edge wasn't a scared widow. It was a woman waiting in the mouth of stone, backlit by heat, baby in her arms, eyes fixed forward. You come for warmth or war? She asked. No one answered, but to turned round. The other first stepped forward and the night began to crack. It was past midnight when the 4 men finally crossed the last drift. The wind snapped at their coats, making the ropes at their belts whip like snakes. Their faces were pale, not from fear exactly, but from the kind of pride that hardens into something uglier in the cold. Lanterns swung in their hands. The axes were slung low, blades dull, but heavy. Ada stood just outside the cave's main entrance. The light from her stove behind her threw a long, uneven shadow that licked across the snow like ink. Her arms were wrapped around her child, and her breath curled in clouds through the narrow pass. She wore no coat, just a thick shawl and the red scarf that made her look like something carved out of brick and blood. Widow, bark-bellied man, Harold Jenkins. This isn't a threat. We just need to see what's inside. You've seen, Ada said, her voice calm. The sick are fed, the frozen are warm, the fires shared. Not enough. You picked who gets in. You set the rules, but we all hurt the same, you hear? You can't play God just cause you found a hole in the rock and made it smoke. Behind her, the child stirred. Ada pulled the shawl tighter, then looked past them down the slope where only darkness lay. You came to rob me, she said. No, said the second man, Willis Griggs, a younger brother from the edge of town. We came to take back what you've kept. You'll take nothing. You think you can stop us, and here she smiled, but not kindly. No, the mountain will. Then she turned and vanished into the cave. The men hesitated just enough for the cold to sting their wrists. Then Jenkins stepped forward and shoved aside the curtain of burlap she'd hung as a makeshift door. What lay inside was not what they expected. The first chamber was warm, yes, but almost too warm. The air pressed against their faces like steam, thick with the smell of pine smoke and clay. The walls had been hung with rugs, old blankets, stitched hides, anything to insulate. But it wasn't a mess. It wasn't wild. It was organized, intentional. A long bench ran the left-hand wall, stacked with jars of beans and corn. Aloe stove in the corner glowed like a crouched animal. Every space had a purpose, and every crack had been sealed with mud and moss so precisely it looked like brickwork. Where's the gold? One muttered. Where's the bedroom? Jenkins snapped. She had vanished down the inner passage, the narrow rock corridor that bent at an odd angle and sloped slightly downward. Stay close, Jenkins growled. Lifting his lantern, the deeper they moved, the quieter it became. Even their boots fell silent, muffled by earth and skin rugs beneath. The heat remained steady, like the inside of a sleeping beast. The walls here had been carved smoother, wide, enough only for one man at a time. Then they saw the curtain, red fabric, heavy, hung with nails driven into the rock. Jenkins raised a hand, motioned for the others to wait. He grabbed the edge and pulled it back, and what he saw inside shook him. Not because it was magical, not because it was strange, but because it was perfect. The bedroom was no more than 10 feet by 12, but the floor was pulped. The roof was rounded with mud and hay plastering, and the heat, Lord, the heat felt like a hearth. Fire at your back. The bed was raised on a frame of thick logs layered with quilts and furs. A second, smaller stove built into the stone emitted a low hum. On the shelves, candles, sewing needles, tins of dried meat. On the wall, a crucifix handcard. The baby lay sleeping in a cradle, peaceful, pink-cheeked, mouth slight lipen. And in the far corner, seated on a stool with a knife in one hand and a branch of kindling in the other, Ada Loomis, her eyes locked with Jenkins, unblinking. You brought axes, she said. He couldn't speak. You thought I had gold, still nowards. She stood and the fire shifted behind her, making her shadow dance high across the ceiling. Tell me, She said, "What would you have done with it? Silence by a coat. A bottle, fix your chimney." Jenkins finally found his voice. "You think you're better than us?" "No," she said. "I think I prepared. I think I worked. And I think you want to take, not build. We're all suffering and I bled for this. I carried these stones in my apron. I stitched these walls when my hands were raw. I fed your children, and still you brought blades." The baby stirred. She lowered her voice. "Leave." One of the men behind. Jenkins muttered, "We should just..." And that's when the mountain answered with a crack, not a shout, not a quake, just a sound like a bone snapping beneath a boot. They turned, the tunnel behind them. The narrow corridor they had crept through was no longer open. A sheet of rock had broken loose from the ceiling, collapsed clean across the passage. Jenkins rushed forward, tried to move it, but it was 3 feet thick and heavier than any 2 men combined. "We're trapped," he gasped. "No," said A.A., "you're safe." She picked up her child. "Rest, warm yourselves, and in the morning, you'll dig." They slept in shifts. The fire never dimmed, and sometime near dawn, Jenkins woke to find a bowl of stew beside his hand and a blanket draped across his shoulders. He didn't remember falling asleep. When they emerged the next day, eyes squinting in the sunlight, it was into a different world because the storm had passed, the ridge had softened, and the valley was crawling with footsteps, men and women, children and elders, all clustered along the slope, watching the cave like pilgrims before a shrine. The word had spread, not just about the warmth, but about what was inside. A woman had turned a cave into a home and a home into salvation, not through magic, not through luck, but through refusal. She had refused to freeze, refused to fail, refused to let a world built for men decide where and how her child would sleep. And now the town stood quiet before her cave, not demanding, not laughing, just waiting. The sheriff approached first, hat in hand, boots coated with new snow. He didn't ask to come in. He just said, "We'd like to learn." Ada stood at the threshold, the baby on her hip, smoke rising behind her. Then she nodded, "You'll learn by doing." And so they did. The next weeks were a blur. She didn't open the cave Tovar Iwan. That was never her way, but she taught. She showed them how to insulate the inside of a wall, not just the outside, how to stack clay between logs so no air slipped through, how to use heated bricks at night instead of burning too much fuel. She taught them to keep water from freezing by burying barrels, to hang soaked sheets that trapped heat near ceilings, to sleep to a bed not for love but for warmth, and the town changed. Cabins got warmer, stoves smoked steadier, children stopped coughing, and no one laughed at the cabin more. In fact, they stopped calling it a cave. They called it the room, capital R, because it wasn't just a space anymore. It was a symbol, a statement that a woman alone could outthink the mountain. That survival wasn't always loud. It was clever, careful, constant, and aider. She didn't become a leader. She didn't want to be. But when the spring thaw came, the snow slid off the ridge like a dying wave, and the town gathered for the first time in weeks under a pale blue sky. They invited her to speak. She stood in the churchyard, baby on her hip, red scarf still tied at her throat, and she said, "I didn't do anything you couldn't have. I just started sooner." That summer they offered her a new cabin high on the hill, best view in town. She declined. She stayed in the mountain, where the stone held her dreams tight, and Ewan never dared to knock. By the time the crocuses pushed up through the last crusts of snow, the laughter had stopped for good. The jokes about Ader, about her hole in the rock, about her crazy caveed, they withered in the long freeze like so many cabins that never got warm. And what remained in town was something new, not quite reverence, not keep guilt, more like a quiet, unspoken understanding that they'd all lived through something together, and she had kept more of them alive than they liked to admit. They brought her gifts now, not offerings in the old sense, not bows and thanks and praise, but practical things. A new coil of wire, a bag offler, a lantern with fresh oil, always left on the edge of the trail near Thapis, never forced into her hand. She never said much about them, but she took them. She'd earned that much, and the cave changed to slowly. She added a second chamber, not quite as large as the first, with help this time. A few of the younger men, those who hadn't laughed in the first place, offered their labor. She let them haul stone, taught them how to chisel without shaking the roof loose. She showed them how to run stovepipe through rock without letting heat bleed out. It wasn't a commune, not a shelter for all, but it became a design, a model. By midsummer, 3 families had copied her plans, digging part of their cabins back into hillbanks, building double walls with hay stuffing and brick insulation. The town's lone blacksmith started shaping iron stoves with thicker bellies and better, damper controls just like Kadaha's. And they worked that next winter, noddeds, none, even the oldest man in town, nearly blind, bones like sugar sticks, made it through with only a cough and a sore hip. Fires burned slow, steadier, roofs held, chimneys didn't choke, but no fire. Burned quite like Kita's, and still she stayed up there in the mountain, half a mile from the nearest cabin. In that little world of stone she'd made warm with nothing but her own 2 hands. A few links of iron and a will thick as frost. Her child grew quickly. By spring, the girl was crawling across for rugs and pulling down her mother's sewing kit. By midsummer, she was walking the ridge alone, barefoot, chasing marmots and collecting feathers. Every week someone in town saw her on a slope or between trees and said, "Is that the Lumi's child?" It always was. Strong-legged, wild-haired, bright-eyed in a way that made older folks pause and say under their breath that one was born in a cave. During the storm, like it means something. Like it would mean something later. They were right. Come August, when the first mountain rains came through like knives from the sky, the girl didn't hide indoors. She stood out in it, face up, arms wide, like someone greeting an old friend. Aida watched it from the doorway, not smiling, but softer, like maybe she could breathe know. Because something else had changed. Not just in the cabins or the stoves or the eyes of the men who once brought access, but in her. She slept easier. Shall it? The fire burned lower some nights. She wrote things in a little leather book by the stove when the baby slept. No one saw what she wrote, but she kept at it. Then one day in late September, the sheriff came up the ridge again, hat off, hands gloved, boots muddy from the lower roads. Ada met him outside, same as always. He looked tired. "There's a man," he said. "Newsletter from east of Laram says he's an engineer. Claims he can make us a wind furnace for the schoolhouse. And he wants to build it up here near you." She didn't answer. "Wants to study your work," he added. "Calls it thermal retention architecture. Says you're years ahead of anything he's seen." Ada said nothing for a while, then tell him no. "You sure? I'm not a relic," she said. "I'm a woman who survived, and I don't want scholars. I want quiet." The sheriff tipped his hat. "I'll tell him." He turned to go, then paused. "You know, I heard something down in town might interest you." She waited. Hal looked at her sideways. Half a smile tugging one corner of his face, said the council's renaming Winter Hollow Road. Ada blinked. "They're calling it Lumisway." She exhaled once. Not quite a sigh, not quite relief. "Tell them I don't need a street. They need one." He left her then, and she stood there in the high breeze, her child at her knee. The smoke from the cave curling up behind them like a memory that hadn't faded yet. The snow came early that year and hard. The kind that slams doors shut, cracks window panes, makes even the river slow to a crawl. But not a soul froze, not one, and every night. Through the blue-black frost and the wind that clawed down from the ridge, a single thin line of smoke rose from the mountain, steady, clean. The cave had stayed warm, just like always, and this time not a soul laughed, no Tevin once.